So, this is my multimedia project on Robert Zajonc. I'm really hoping I'm pronouncing his last name right, Zajonc. But for the most part, I think I'm just going to refer to him as Robert. Robert was a social psychologist. He was born in Poland on November 23rd, 1923. He was an only child. So, his family fled to Warsaw in 1939 before the Nazi invasion. And what's really sad is they had only been there a short period of time before the building that they were living in was air raided. So basically, it just blew up. And he was only 16 at the time, and both of his parents ended up dying. He himself, Robert, was critically injured, but he lived. He then continued his time in Warsaw to study at an underground university, where then he was sent to a German labor camp. And I'm not sure how long he was there for, but he managed to escape. He was then recaptured and sent to another labor camp, which also kind of was a political prison. He escaped again, and then he joined the French resistance and continued his education at the University of Paris. So after Paris, he went to the University of Tübingen, and he immigrated to the U.S. after World War II. He attended the University of Michigan, and I don't know how true this is. I thought it was pretty interesting. He only attended the University of Michigan because it was the only school to offer him a fellowship. He had actually applied to a ton of schools in the U.S., and he ended up teaching there for 4 decades after graduating. He obtained a PhD in 1995 from there, and then he ended up holding a variety of different titles there. He was the director of the Institute for Social Research, director of the Research Center for Group Dynamics, and after the 4 decades were over, he went to go work at Stanford University, where he was a professor of emeritus of psychology. And his contributions to psychology, Robert had many theories, mostly known for his social cognitive structures and the cognitive tuning theory. So he focused on social psychology, but he would often wander into, different fields of psychology. I can see how that can easily happen. He came up with the mere exposure effect, social facilitation, convergence in spouses' appearances, the affective neuroscience hypothesis, hypothalamic cooling in rats. A popular one was the confluence model, which I'll talk about each of these individually, and then the sensory interaction on non-human animals. So the mere exposure effect, which came about in 1968. So this basically was it showed that people show an increased liking or preference for someone or something, the stimulus, as long as they're more exposed to it. So it usually happens when individuals have no bad or negative feelings towards the stimulus beforehand, and also seems to have a stronger effect when the person doesn't really notice the stimulus being presented to them. So Robert, in this instance, he suggested that the first few times someone is exposed to something, it matters the most, as these first moments are what set the standard. He also added the word mere to it because it could easily be applied to anything. So mere exposure effect. Yeah, I can see that. So it could be easily applied to anything, any sort of conditions that would make it noticeable or perceptible to someone or, well, any individual. To support his hypothesis, Robert did 3 different studies. So these 3 different studies included exposing people to certain words, interpersonal contact and interpersonal attraction, and then exposing people to certain music. So I can see how this sometimes applies to, well, situations to myself. Listening to a song that someone has just came out with for the first 2-3 times, hate it, don't like it, but I really don't know if I'll like it until I listen to it in my car. So if I like it in my car and I've listened to it a few times, hearing it over and over, I end up liking the song. So that's an example I can give of the mere exposure effect. Moving on to social facilitation. Robert came up with a theory that basically explained how people perform tasks when they're doing it in front of other people rather than when they're alone. So people doing simple tasks or something they are very familiar with are able to do it better in front of an audience since they have, well, more practice doing it. And someone doing a task that they aren't familiar with and then trying to do it in front of others, they would perform worse. To support this, Robert did an experiment using cockroaches, having them either run in easy tunnels or hard tunnels and timing them. The cockroaches benefited from social facilitation only with dealing with the easy tunnels with the direct path. As for the harder tunnels, having other cockroaches around seemed to make them nervous, which resulted in them slowing down compared to them doing it by themselves and being alone. I want to give an example of me. Well, right now I'm in the library recording this. I am way more productive being alone here than being at home and surrounded by everyone being noisy. Moving on to the convergence in spouse's appearance. I really thought this one was pretty interesting because people say this about my parents. They've been together for 25 years, and people point out some facial features that are similar between them. Yeah, they're not related, but I guess I can kind of see what they mean. So this theory proposed that emotional processes produce changes that are regulated by facial musculature. So basically saying that couples that were happily married or just married for a long period of time started to resemble each other. He did a study with 12 married couples. So 12 pictures of the men at the time of their wedding, and then 12 pictures of them 25 years later. Same with the woman. So living with someone for, over 20, 25 years, you both go through the same emotions. Sadness, fear, happiness. This can cause you both to have the same facial expressions. And having this repeated for so long, you guys will probably end up having, the same marks on the face. You also, most of the time, consume the same food, so the same diet, living in the same weather, the sun, heat exposure. You guys are doing basically the same stuff for how long? I can see how that can happen. Affective neuroscience hypothesis. So this one, so basically Robert argued that our moods were dependent on the temperature of our brain. So how this worked, basically the blood from the brain was controlled by our facial expressions. So when this blood would make its way from the brain to the sinus cavities, then flowing into the rest of the body through the veins, since this route the blood is taking is so close to the hypothalamus, this meant that the heat of the blood was said to basically influence or, affect the hypothalamus, which is our control center in our brain that is able to turn our emotions into physical responses. So if the hypothalamus was cooled by happy facial expressions, this would cool the hypothalamus, and then you would have more positive emotions. If you had sad or angry facial expressions, this would warm the hypothalamus and result in negative emotions. Robert was able to test out this theory by having a few participants in a research group say words or vowels that would force their face to have a happy or a sad facial expression. Let's see. Robert ended up trying this hypothalamic cooling in rats, because why not, right? Since he knew that it had effects over humans, he wanted to see if it would also work in rats. So the cooling or heating of the hypothalamic had any effect to the pleasure the rats would find in food, or if they would find the food any more appealing. He was able to find out that the rats seemed to eat better when the hypothalamic was cooled, but it didn't seem to have a difference when it was heated down or just left at a normal temperature. He ended up doing an experiment with 17 rats. So one of his most popular theories was the confluence model. Robert came up with this with Greg Marcus, and they came up with it in 1975. So this explained basically how a large family, the larger a family got, their overall IQ would drop. They also stated that kids who came from larger families did in fact have lower IQs. Not a big difference. I found it to be about, maybe a 3 IQ point difference at the most, but it was true. So this explained how in the order in which you were born and the size of the family you were born into affected your IQs. So he said that younger kids had lower IQs since they didn't have as many opportunities to teach their younger siblings, since they were, towards the end. They were the last ones. Thank God. I'm the firstborn, huh? So moving on to sensory interaction on animals. In this experiment, Robert used pigeons to find out whether a stimulus response only depends on the intensity or if other factors also influence the response. In this case, he wanted to see if the use of the light would have any sort of impact on the responses the pigeons would give or affect their actions. Both the pigeons he used were males, and Robert somehow trained them to be able to use their pecks to hit two keys that made different noises. The left key was for a loud noise, and the right key was for a soft noise. If they did it correctly, they were then given food, so they knew what to do, right, to get fed. So once a trial would end, Robert would shut off the lights and then turn them back on, which would signal to the pigeons that they were about to start another trial. Robert ended up being correct about how the light would affect the pigeons when responding, as the intensity of the tone of the keys and then him flickering the lights on and off, they would also contribute to the pigeons' responses. So I found a few awards. I'm pretty sure he got more than this, that Robert ended up obtaining: the APS William James Fellow Award, the APA Distinguished Scientific Contribution Award, the SESP Distinguished Scientist Award. He left a legacy mostly known for his attitude formation. That's the confluence model, the effect of birth on order intelligence, and the mere exposure theory. I was reading through an interview that he gave that was, published for the Association of Psychological Science. He was asked, how would you best choose a mentor? And he responded, choose one you can have a drink with, which is probably, for the most part, very true. You would want someone that can be your friend to mentor you. And I found a video on YouTube of other psychologists and social scientists. This was after Robert had already passed, and they toasted to him, and they all spoke very highly of him, how he was with his colleagues, how he was with his students, how he was a great person. So I didn't really find anything that said he was bad or a terrible person. So for the most part, Robert Zajonc was a good person. He ended up dying in December 3rd, 2008, at the age of 85 in California from pancreatic cancer. So that was the end of Robert's life, but not the end of his legacy, as we still continue to talk about him. So, oh my God, I went over the 15 minutes. Well, that's it. Thank you.